Hello and welcome. I'm Ariana Droz, and you're listening to Reprint, brought to you by the Temple News. This podcast gives readers an in-depth review of stories that were printed in this week's edition. This week, I'll be sitting with Assistant News Editor Nathan Horwitz to discuss Temple's dropped fire ranking, and then later I'll be sitting with Caelan O'Neill, Opinion Editor, to talk about a newly opened queer-owned sports bar on South Street. Hi, Nathan.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Do you want to give a brief summary about your piece and talk a little bit about what you're making of this situation currently?
Yeah, so my piece is about the Temple dropped 139 places in the Fire Free Speech rankings. What do I make of it? I think that it is representative to some degree of how students are feeling on campus. In fairness, the survey only included upwards of 300 Temple students. So take that for what it is. But yeah, I think it shows that, some people are not feeling comfortable expressing their views, and I think there is truth to that. I will also say that Temple's drop in the rankings is more complicated than, speech just got way worse. It is based on their grading, Fire's grading criteria had a big impact on it. Changes in their criteria.
Yeah. So there were several policies that you mentioned in your piece from the university that are meant to prevent harassment, but Fire labeled them as prone to abuse or too vague. Mm-hmm. So do you think that the university should have to rewrite the policies more clearly according to Fire's standards?
Well, Fire's standards are based on the Supreme Court's standard for what free speech is. I do think that there are some valid criticisms that Fire's making about some of the policies. For instance, the one about harassment. So the wording for the PADH, the preventing harassment, basically the preventing harassment policy, it uses the language of banning things that are severe and pervasive, Temple uses the language of severe or pervasive rather than severe and pervasive, which is what the Supreme Court's standard is for it. And so that opens the door for, what is pervasive? Pervasive is basically something that is like unwelcome and reoccurring. So that can open the door for sort of arbitrary application yeah.
Yeah. So maybe the university should consider being a little bit more direct in their approach mm-hmm. to what language they're using to define what is harmful and to students.
Right. Yeah. That's the message pretty much.
Okay. Just to shift the focus a bit to another point that you brought up in your piece in regard to the student who was suspended, and mm-hmm. this was controversial. They were suspended because of an offensive sign that went viral on the internet. So do you think it's up to the university to navigate the balance between protected free speech mm-hmm. that might be offensive, but also facilitating a safe and inclusive campus environment? Mm-hmm. How do you think that Temple should navigate that situation?
Right. So I think it can become complicated, especially in the day and age of social media, right? So it's one thing when something is maybe said to a few people, that's where I could be a little more nuanced there and be like, that person probably shouldn't be suspended necessarily for something that happened in a, one time in a, closed setting. But with social media where things get amplified to thousands of voices, Temple is, sort of a business, and so they don't want to be, when things get that much attention brought to them, it's hard to say, like, they should just let it go because they don't want to be, associated with hate speech and things like that. And they're not the government, so they have the ability to handle it as they see fit. I think that it, on the other hand, right, I think it does create a precedent that can be exploited, right, because some things are largely agreed upon are offensive or hate speech, but at the end of the day, that does come down to, who's calling the shots on that. And so it can create a slippery slope potentially, or just a situation where, if the people running the administration in the future or whatever decide that, just a general political view or something, just an opinion that maybe it's not really regarded by the masses as offensive, that can create a situation where voices are being silenced.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, our score went down because that student was suspended. So it just creates an interesting narrative for Temple and for Fire, I think. Kind of piggybacking off of that point, there are concerns from students that Fire is working to protect more conservative speech and viewpoints. Based on your conversations with them or any research that you did, how do you think that they would respond to these claims? And do you think that they are as nonpartisan as they are projecting?
Honestly, I can't speak too much to how partisan or not they are. I can't also really speak to what the response would exactly be, but based on my interview, I believe, and what their mission statement is, they claim to be nonpartisan. They claim to basically abide by, neutrality, institutional neutrality, and the Constitution and the Supreme Court's stance on free speech. And so I think that would be the response, is that they follow the Constitution with their stance on what should be allowed to be said. And as far as them being nonpartisan, the only instance that they highlight is the instance of that happened with the Barstool Sports situation. But we also saw the SJP chapter was disbanded over protests about Israel and things like that. And that's more of a generally left-leaning political stance. And so, yeah, and that was not included in. Temple did not lose points for that, so there's something to be said for that, I think.
Looking ahead, do you think that there are next steps that the university could take to possibly include students, staff, and faculty to move forward and make a better policy so that we can have a more inclusive campus that also facilitates and encourages free speech?
I don't know if I'm qualified to say for that. I feel like, I do feel like the starting point is talking and communication, and going from there, but also organizing and making your voice heard and your opinions heard, so that so that the administration or the government, whatever power that be that we're thinking of, is going to be more open to hearing out what you have to say.
Hi, Caelan.
Hi.
Thank you for joining me today. Do you want to give a brief summary of your piece and what you want the main takeaway for readers to be?
Okay, so my essay is about Marsha's, which is the new sports bar down on 4th and South Street in South Philly. It is a queer women's sports bar, so it predominantly plays women's sports throughout the week, and it's a new safe space in the queer community for any people of the queer community who want to hang out, and it's really special to me, and that's why I wrote about it, is because there are very few queer spaces in Philadelphia, and the ones that do exist are centered around men, and a lot of them are becoming very unsafe, and a lot are becoming very straight. And so I was really excited about this bar opening, and I want the main takeaway to be that for any queer students to know that there are safe spaces out there for them, and maybe you have to look, and maybe they're kind of small, but they're not any less important because they're small or new.
So you mentioned how the line was 2 blocks down South Street, and that the first time you tried, you couldn't even get in to the bar. Yeah. So the fact that there's such an overwhelming amount of people, how do you think that speaks to the need to have more queer and specifically sapphic spaces in the city?
So I think that it is just like an indication of how much this space is needed. I also wrote about this in the articles. This organization called Sip City, which is basically like a traveling lesbian bar in the sense that it'll rent out a space for 3 to 4 hours. But then after the 3 to 4 hours, like the space opens to the public and we lose that environment. And sometimes there's lines for those, and those are in bigger bars. So I think that it just really indicates that not only is there a need for it, but people who maybe want to open a space like this shouldn't fear it because it's going to be successful, I think. Like, you know, even the second night when I went back, it was packed. They said they were over capacity inside the bar. And we waited probably like 35 minutes still. I just had more people and was more willing to stick out the wait.
So you mentioned organizations like Sip City that rent out spaces for a few hours to create community or facilitate community. And compared to Marsha's, how do you think a permanent space will affect emotional and cultural permanence of queer and sapphic community in Philly?
Great question. Because with like new legislation that's happening, or not even legislation, but just like acts of violence against the queer community from the government, like removing certain letters off of like the LGBTQ government website, and removing like bi and trans people from the Stonewall Memorial. I think that a permanent space that is owned by a queer person isn't susceptible to those kind of changes. Like, it's gonna have to be like a full government takedown to get rid of Marsha's, where any of these spaces that Sip City rents out at any moment could just be like, oh no, like we don't want your event here, and they could potentially like not even give a real reason, but be like, oh yeah, we're just not available that day, sorry. And so I think Marsha's really gives the like rally cry that we're here to stay, and you can't get rid of us. And I think that's really special.
Yeah, it's really important too.
Yeah.
Okay. So, moving forward, what are your hopes for Marsha's, and how do you think that other communities in Philly can support this establishment moving forward? Because, I mean, inevitably there's going to be some controversy that it even opened up. So, how can we protect this space, and how can we enlist others who might not be queer or sapphic to protect this space?
Yeah, I think given the fact that it's a sports bar, some even queer people are just kind of going to be like, oh, I don't want to go, I don't know anything about sports. It's not like you walk in and there's like foosball tables and air hockey tables and foosball, or did I say foosball? I meant skee ball. That is like in the way that garage is, where it's like very bro-y, very frat, very male-centered sport. It's like there's some TVs hanging up that are playing sports, but like you can talk to anyone about anything, and there's tables far away from the sports. You don't even have to deal with that if you don't like sports or like adamantly hate them. And I think that if other communities wanted to support Marsha so that it doesn't close, they could do collaborations like queer service industry nights for anyone else who works in like restaurants or bars or anything like that, where like they go in and get a discount, or Latinx queer community is like a big thing, or like any person of color, like having like some dedicated nights or events for those communities, so that there can be more intersection in the culture at Marsha's.
Last question. Is there anything else in your piece that you want to highlight or expand more upon that you didn't get a chance to already?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really go into this in the piece, but there are other bars who started out as gay bars specifically for men. But then straight women started going because they were safer for straight women. Totally understandable. But then the men followed them. And I am so scared that this is going to happen to Marsha's. And it's not like I want to like gatekeep it or anything. But this is for the queer community. Like every other bar in Philly is made for people not in the queer community. And I think that, you know, if you are with a group of your friends who are not in the queer community and they're like, hey, let's go check out this new sports bar, maybe don't. Maybe like advocate to go somewhere else and say like, hey, like this isn't our space, we can't infiltrate it. You know, I always say like, if my 7 queer friends and I invite this one straight person, that makes sense because they're there to hang out with us, but not to take advantage of the space that's been created. And it does make me really sad for other people who are seeking that same space but don't have it. But we don't have to take away from one community to try to give to another. Okay, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Freeprint. Catch these stories and many more on our website at www.temple-news.com. You can also keep up with all things TTN on our social media at The Temple News on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. See you next time.